Hey everybody, it's Johnny Two-Face here, back with another reaction video. This time reacting to HMS Victory sailing and fighting a Napoleonic warship by Epic History TV. Now, if you haven't seen my reaction to part 1 of this guide to HMS Victory, I suggest you check that out before checking this one out. And the usual disclaimer when I react to anything historical, if I don't show so much what is considered a proper reaction, is probably obvious I don't know much about the subject at hand, and if I do know anything, I'll most likely pause the video to give my input or ask any curious questions, which hopefully will be answered in the comments below. With that being said, the link to the original video will be in the description down below. Please go and subscribe to Epic History TV, a great history channel here on YouTube, much better than the History Channel on TV by miles. Sorry, that was a bit of a weird side note. But yeah, so link to the original in the description down below, and without further ado, let's get this up on screen and see what happens in part 2 of this guide. Now, I kind of made it, before I start, I did mistakenly think that this was only a 2-part guide, so without actually checking, so I'm not sure if this is the last part of this guide, but let's see what happens. So anyway, let's get into the video.
HMS Victory, one of Britain's most powerful warships, in an age when Britain dominated the seas.
Oh yeah.
During the Napoleonic Wars, such ships were Britain's wooden walls, protecting the homeland from invasion, while devastating enemy commerce and protecting Allied shipping. Ships of the line were the largest and most sophisticated war machines of the conflict. Britain had around 140 in total, more than any other nation. But her advantage came less from numbers or better ship design than the qualities of the men who sailed them. Bold and experienced commanders, disciplined and eager crews, all full of confidence and accustomed to victory. This video is sponsored by War Thunder, the most comprehensive combined arms combat game ever. To War Thunder for
feel free to check out
video.
War Thunder if you're interested. The crew, okay.
At the height of the Napoleonic Wars, around 145,000 men served in Britain's Royal Navy, a number comparable to European field armies of the period. Ships of the line, like HMS Victory, required huge crews, not so much to sail her, as to man her heavy guns. At the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, she had 820 men aboard, a little short of her full complement of 850. Just 15 of these men were commissioned officers, one admiral commanding the fleet, one captain in command of the ship, 9 naval lieutenants, and 4 Royal Marine officers. Then the senior warrant officers, including the ship's master in charge of navigation, the gunner, responsible for the ship's guns, small arms, powder, and shot, the boatswain, responsible for sails and rigging, and who with his mates oversaw all work on deck. 2 ship's carpenters, responsible for keeping the ship afloat and making repairs, the purser, in charge of ship's provisions, a surgeon for the crew's physical welfare, and a chaplain for their spiritual. Victory also had 21 midshipmen. These were young cadet officers, some of whom began their naval careers at just 13.
Wow.
They served a 6-year apprenticeship at sea, learning seamanship, sail handling, navigation, mathematics, and trigonometry. They'd then be qualified to sit the lieutenant's exam, a rigorous assessment by a board of naval captains. Further promotion to commander, then captain, would depend on merit, and, crucially, social and political connections. The process could be hugely frustrating for those without influential friends.
That's the problem. That's the only problem in this sort of situation, is the politics behind it. Where, like, it was easy to get a promotion, obviously, if you had, like, a special lineage or powerful friends in politics. If you didn't, it was a huge struggle.
As satirized in this cartoon by the famous illustrator George Cruikshank. Some naval officers came from aristocratic families, but most were from what today we'd call the middle classes. HMS Victory carried 43 clerks, orderlies, stewards and servants to assist the officers. 69 junior warrant officers, petty officers and their mates held various specialist roles, such as coxswain, armourer and sailmaker. There were 212 able seamen, the veteran sailors. 193 ordinary seamen with at least a year's service. 87 landsmen, mostly new recruits, only good for hauling on ropes. 142 Royal Marine non-commissioned officers and privates, soldiers who fought at sea, led amphibious landings, and enforced discipline. And 31 ship's boys, many of them orphans plucked from destitution, now destined for a life at sea. Each man was assigned a station for every maneuver. Top men were the fittest, bravest sailors who handled the sails high above deck. Forecastle men were knowledgeable veterans who handled anchors and bowsprit sails. The wasters in the ship's waist and afterguard on the quarterdeck and poop were for hauling on ropes. The crew was organized into two halves, the larboard watch and starboard watch. They took turns on and off duty, except for emergencies when all hands were called on deck. They were further organized into divisions, each commanded by a lieutenant responsible for his men's welfare and conduct. HMS Victory's crew, like that of most British warships, was surprisingly cosmopolitan. Most were from Britain and Ireland, but about 10% were foreigners, including Americans, Italians, Dutch, Maltese, and West Indians. About half were volunteers. The rest had been impressed, meaning they'd been forced into military service by the Navy's notorious press gangs. These naval recruitment parties scoured ports and passing ships for British sailors, all of whom were considered fair game for compulsory enlistment. The process was not always entirely peaceful.
No, I can imagine.
Navy press gangs were feared and despised by civilians. They were known to seize men who were not sailors, or even British, though most were later released if they could prove their identity. And there were limits. Contrary to popular myth, the Navy did not press vagrants, nor did it accept criminals convicted of serious crimes. To get the best out of a ship like Victory, the captain had to know his crew and his ship. Every vessel has its own best point of sailing relative to the wind. HMS Victory's was 1 or 2 points off her stern. This means she made her best speed, around 10 knots, sailing in these directions. But large ships do not sail in a straight line, due to leeway, the effect of the wind pushing the ship's hull sideways. This was something the helmsman steering the ship at the ship's wheel had to correct for. The officer of the watch, usually a lieutenant, was responsible for the ship when on duty, and ordered which sails to set and take in. He would summon the captain if the situation required it. In strong winds, Victory might sail under topsails alone, perhaps with a jib and flying jib. In lighter winds, she would crowd on sail, adding courses, to'garnsails and royals. She might even run out the stunsail booms to set studding sails, pronounced stunsails. This was known as sailing large. But if the wind picked up, stunsails and royals had to be brought in quickly, as spars and sails could be damaged or torn away by a sudden strong gust. No sailing ship can sail directly into the wind. Victory's closest point of sail was 6 points off the wind. This was known as sailing close hauled or on a bowline. There were two methods of sailing against the wind. The first was tacking. This zigzag approach required precise sail handling and could strain spars and rigging. The alternative was wearing ship, an easier maneuver to perform, but slower, as it meant going the long way around. Anchoring a large warship like Victory was also a complex operation. The sea's depth was discovered by casting the lead, literally throwing a lead weight tied to a rope into the sea. The rope clearly marked every fathom, or 6 feet. The preferred depth for anchoring was 40 fathoms or less, though it was possible in deeper water. First, the ship reduced speed by taking in sail. When the ship came to a halt, the anchor was let go, with a marker buoy attached. As current and backed sails began to drive the ship sternwards, the anchor cable was run out, using 3 times the length needed to reach the sea bottom. It was the weight of this giant cable, as much as the anchor, that kept the ship in position. Depending on weather, tide, and sea bottom, it might be necessary to set several of Victory's anchors to keep the ship safely moored. A less well-known inshore maneuver was kedging. This was a way to drag the ship against wind or tide, using manpower alone. The lighter kedge anchor was carried in a ship's boat, rowed out ahead of the ship, and let go. The crew then turned the capstan to haul the ship towards the anchor. This exhausting process was repeated as many times as necessary to move the ship into position. Another version of this was warping, in which ropes were attached to a fixed object, like a strong tree on shore, and the ship hauled towards it.
The hotter the war, the sooner the peace, British seamen sayings. Fighting the ship.
In naval combat, the first consideration was always the direction and strength of the wind. A ship upwind or to windward had the advantage and was said to have the weather gauge. She could choose if and when to initiate battle, while the ship to leeward had to struggle into the wind to reach her adversary. Ships of all nations sometimes flew a false flag, that of another nation, to hide their identity. This was considered fair practice, but to fire on an enemy without first hoisting your true colours was an unpardonable crime.
Wow.
When about to engage the enemy, the captain would order, "Beat to quarters." To the rattle of the Marines' drums, the ship was cleared for action. All temporary cabins on gun decks were dismantled and taken to the hold, so gun crews could work without obstruction. The sick bay was cleared away and all its patients carried down to the orlop deck. The galley stove was put out to reduce the risk of fire, and ammunition was moved up from the magazines to the gun decks. The ship's boats were launched and towed behind the ship. Here they were less likely to be smashed to splinters by enemy fire, and were immediately ready for any emergency. Sand was poured on the deck for traction, while splinter netting was put up above the decks to protect men from any falling spars or pulleys shot down by enemy fire. Every man then took up his station for battle. Captain and officers in full uniform on the quarterdeck. Topmen aloft, ready to trim sail. Sharpshooters on the fighting tops. Carpenter's crew on the orlop deck, ready to plug holes below the waterline. Gunners' mates in the magazine, filling extra cartridges. The surgeon in the cockpit, ready to receive casualties. For 3/4 of the crew, battle stations meant the gun decks, manning one of the ship's 104 guns. It was a huge amount of firepower for the age, and made her one of the most heavily armed warships in the world. Her heaviest cannon were the 32-pounders of the lower gun deck. At point-blank range, these guns could punch through 2 feet of solid oak. Wow. Heavy breaching ropes held each gun in place. Otherwise, recoil would have sent 4 tons of gun and carriage flying across the deck after every shot. Each gun had a crew of between 10 and 14, which was divided in half if the ship needed.
Quick side note, like you know, in TV shows like that have ships of this age in them, like where they should have the cannons fire and they like go back slowly. In real life, they would just literally just go wow. They'll just literally near enough like at least hundreds of miles an hour backwards, just literally whoom, like that. Not like in TV or films where they just go like that. The cannons, once they fire, thanks to the breaching ropes holding them, but the cannons, when they fire, they literally just go like that. They'll literally launch backwards at high speeds.
Needed to fire on.
And quite a few inexperienced sailors have been killed by that happening, because some of these decks can be crowded, and as soon as one of the cannons flybacks and hits them, all that crushing force will kill you instantly.
On both sides. Each crew was led by a gun captain. He was responsible for aiming the gun, his crew shifting its massive weight with handspikes, crowbars and wedges. When he was on target, the gun captain either applied a slow match to the touch hole, or, as seen here, pulled a lanyard attached to a gun lock to fire the gun. To reload, one man first blocked the vent with his thumb or a stopper to prevent sparks getting into the barrel during loading. The barrel was then sponged to extinguish embers and wormed to remove debris. A gunpowder cartridge was inserted at the muzzle and rammed home with a ramrod, followed by the shot, and then a wad to keep everything in place. The gun was run out into firing position, and a pricker inserted into the vent to prick the cartridge and spill the gunpowder. The gun captain then added powder from his powder horn to the vent and priming pan. The gun was now primed, ready to fire again. This process took an experienced British gun crew around 90 seconds.
Wow.
And they were generally faster and more accurate than their adversaries. As a battle wore on, the firing rate would fall dramatically due to exhaustion and casualties. Conditions on a gun deck during battle must have been horrendous. Noise, smoke, sweat, and gruesome wounds caused by shot, flying wooden splinters, and accidents.
What many people don't say is that most of the casualties are not usually done by the cannonballs themselves. It's the shrapnel of the splinters literally just flying out, like literally flying out like a shotgun, basically, just like sharp bits of wood and debris just flying everywhere, and cutting some of these men to pieces. Or a lot if they were under torrential fire.
Battles usually began with a broadside, a ship firing all guns on one side in quick succession. For greater impact, the first broadside could be double-shotted, every gun loaded with 2 rounds. To guarantee penetration of an enemy ship's hull, the range should be less than 500 yards. Many captains preferred extreme close range to fight yardarm to yardarm. The deadliest maneuver was to rake the enemy. To fire a broadside into their stem or stern. Round shot would smash its way the length of the ship, dealing death and mayhem as it went. French ships tended to fire high, on the uproll, aiming for masts and rigging to immobilize the enemy. British ships aimed low, for the hull, trying to knock out guns and crew. At long range, a mile or more, round shot could be skipped across the sea, like skimming pebbles across a pond. Round shot, a solid iron ball, was the most commonly used type of ammunition. Specialist ammunition, such as bar shot, also known as double-headed shot or chain shot, was used to target masts and rigging.
Yeah, if you sit in the way on that, that will literally cut you in half.
At close range, grape shot and canister, both packed with multiple smaller projectiles, turned a gun or carronade into a giant shotgun and were used to wreak havoc.
I was about to say, but he already said it for me.
On an enemy deck. A captain might decide to finish the fight by boarding an enemy warship. Designated boarders armed themselves with muskets, pistols, cutlasses, and half-pikes. The enemy ship was bound tight by grappling hooks, and after a shower of grenados and stink pots, an early form of tear gas, the boarders would swarm across to the enemy deck. In such actions, morale, aggression, and momentum counted more than tactics. Though brutal, such battles were usually over quickly.
Especially if you took out most of the high-ranking seamen on board, like captains or admirals. Take many of them out and try and drop your enemy's morale, which is not in this as the narrator described in this situation is not easy. All hands ahoy! Just wake up call for the bosun's mates. Life at sea.
Combat at sea was relatively rare. Great fleet actions such as Trafalgar and the Nile were rarer still. Just a handful of days spread across 20 years of war. Weeks and months often lay between any encounter with the enemy. Then life at sea was dominated by naval routine, and the passage of time marked by the ship's bell. The naval day began at noon, determined by the officers' observation of the sun with their sextants. The moment the sun reached its highest point was noon. The ship's hourglass was turned, and the bell rung 8 times to mark the beginning of the afternoon watch. Half an hour later, as determined by a half-hour sandglass, the bell was rung once. A half hour later, it was rung twice, and so on. So 5 bells in the afternoon watch was 2:30 p.m. 8 bells meant the start of a new watch, sending half the crew below deck to rest or do other tasks, and bringing the other half on duty. There were 7 watches in all, though the first and second dog watches were only 2 hours long. This meant the 2 halves of the crew switched their routine each day, and one half wasn't always stuck with the same night watches. Senior officers slept in a hanging cot.
Okay.
For everyone else, bed was a hammock strung up from the ship's beams. Most of the men slept on the middle or lower gun decks, their hammocks suspended between the guns, just 16 inches apart. But as most ships operated a two-watch system, half the crew on duty while the other half slept, about half the hammocks were empty at any given time. In normal conditions, only part of the watch was required to sail the ship. The rest carried out various tasks, not least cleaning the ship, scrubbing decks, polishing brass and painting woodwork. This was a matter of maintenance and hygiene, as well as collective pride in their ship's appearance. The crew were fed 3 times daily, though only dinner at noon was a hot meal. They organised themselves into messes of about 8 men, each taking his turn to fetch cooked food from the galley, which was eaten at a table suspended between the guns. Naval food wasn't fancy, but it was sufficient, even for men engaged in long hours of hard labour. Apart from the ship's substantial stores of salted beef, pork and ship's biscuit, the ship took on fresh meat, including livestock, fresh vegetables and water, at every possible opportunity. Most of the crew probably ate better at sea than they would have in civilian life.
Wow.
As well as the daily routine dictated by the ship's bell, there were weekly rituals. Clothes and...
Just a quick side note that he mentioned ship's biscuit. It's basically hardtack, which is basically bread that's been baked quite long until it's like hard as a board, which is it helps preserve the bread. That's what it stops the bread from going off. So it's baked for quite a while until it goes like pretty much solid. And the idea behind it is you're supposed to have it like with grog or ale or rum or water if you fancy. Basically, you're not supposed to eat. Obviously, you're not supposed to eat that hardtack or ship's biscuit dry.
And hammocks washed and hung out to dry once a week, weather permitting. Gunnery practice by divisions. And on Sundays, a church service led by the ship's chaplain, if there was one, or the captain. This was followed, at least once a month, by a public reading of the Articles of War, the regulations that governed conduct and discipline at sea. The articles listed 36 offences, from drunkenness to theft, mutiny, cowardice and striking an officer. Half of these were punishable by death. In several cases, it was the only sentence allowed. British discipline at sea was notoriously severe.
Oh yes.
Crimes for which a sailor was not hanged would usually lead to a flogging with the cat o' nine tails.
Oh.
Drunkenness was the most common offence, not unconnected to the Navy's daily allowance of a gallon of beer per man in home waters, or half a pint of rum or other spirits overseas. This, mixed 4 parts water to 1 part spirits, with lemon or lime juice added to prevent scurvy, was the famous Navy grog. Any man caught drunk or asleep on duty might get 12 lashes, delivered by a boatswain's mate in front of the assembled crew. Serious crimes, such as desertion, might result in 200 lashes or more, a punishment so severe it sometimes killed the prisoner. Some naval captains were ferocious tyrants, but most knew that harsh punishment was best used sparingly. British sailors did not expect an easy life, but did expect to be treated fairly and with dignity. If not, there could be trouble. In 1797, the Royal Navy experienced a large-scale mutiny at Spithead, affecting 16 ships of the line. It was effectively a strike for better pay, as sailors hadn't had a pay rise in more than a century. The mutiny was settled without violence, and the sailors largely got what they wanted.
Wow.
A second mutiny at the Nore made more radical demands, with some crews threatening to defect to France.
Oh.
This time, the authorities were determined to set an example, and hanged 29 ringleaders. Despite hard discipline and service, the British Navy produced crews that were experienced and able, bound together by long service at sea. Men that bold commanders knew they could rely on. The British Navy, well-manned, well-resourced, and backed by a powerful economy, was able to secure complete naval dominance during the Napoleonic Wars. It would prove a crucial factor in Napoleon's defeat. HMS Victory, having played her part, was placed in the Naval Reserve at the end of the war. Narrowly escaping the Breakers' Yard, she became the flagship of the Port Admiral of Portsmouth on England's south coast, and later flagship of the Royal Navy's Commander-in-Chief. After a major refit, Victory began a new life as a museum ship, opening to the public in 1928. Today, she is undergoing another major conservation project to deal with the many challenges faced by a 250-year-old wooden sailing ship. It will ensure her survival far into the future, as a unique memorial to this dramatic age of naval warfare. Thank you to Royal Museums Greenwich for help in collating images for this video. Greenwich in southeast London has been at the centre of British naval history for centuries, and is an essential visit for anyone with an interest in our maritime past. There you can visit the Royal Observatory, home of the Greenwich Meridian, the legendary clipper ship Cutty Sark, and the National Maritime Museum. Their galleries tell the story of Britain's long connection to the sea, a tale of exploration, empire, trade, and military power. Among the many highlights of the collection, the uniform Vice Admiral Nelson was wearing when he was killed at the Battle of Trafalgar. If you love maritime history, make sure you make a visit next time you're in town. Thank you also to Jack Fine Art and the estate of Derek Gardner for permission to use his paintings in this series. You can view many more of his fantastic artworks via the links.
And that'll do it. This has been another interesting video by Epic History TV, and oops, sorry, let me just get that. Sorry, my cursor's playing up a little bit. Right, sorry about that. Don't know what happened there. Anyway, if you like this reaction, please like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.